Hello, and welcome to Spoken Books. A couple of years ago, a friend gave me this book, the Golden Book of Sanctity by Father John Doe. And as I understand it, Father John Doe, Reverend Ralph Fow, was the first Catholic priest to enter into the AA 12-step program. And he wrote a series of books that ask questions like, why? Why would I do this? Why do I want to make these changes? Why do I want to dig this deep? And he gives us some wonderful answers, or at least some ponderings, some things to think about. In this particular book, he looks at sanctity or sainthood. And as it says many times in the AA literature, we are not saints. We are not saints. So the question of why would I want to go down this path? Why would I want to try any of this? I have sinned so much, I can't possibly be forgiven. So why would I want to do this? This is a really neat read that looks at that question and might give us some very fun insight, some very interesting insight. To my friend who gave me this book over 2 years ago, as an exercise in getting ready to do some voice work and asked me to record it for them. Um, I'm learning to be the type of person that does what they say they're going to do. And 2 years later, here it is. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for this book. And thank you for the opportunity, my friend. I give you the Golden Book of Sanctity by Father John Doe. The Golden Book of Sanctity. Another Golden Book by Father John Doe, Reverend Ralph Fow. Copywritten and published by Hazelden Foundation. Me a saint? You know I ain't, and could never be. What's that you say? A man approved today? By God, not men or even me, no matter what I am or will ever be. You mean that I? Well, let's read on and really see what is truly meant by sanctity. O Lord, make me a part of the answer instead of part of the problem. Use me, O God, just as I am today, but above everything else, make me willing, no matter what you make of me, or what you may permit my sins to make of me. Sanctity. Today, the words spiritual and sanctity are almost bad words. Many shy away from even mentioning the terms, and most people seem to be horrified at the idea that they could even think of ever being a saint. And almost inevitably, one gets the reply to the mention of such a possibility, me a saint? That's ridiculous. Even in the AA book, we find the statement used, we are not saints. But the big book does very aptly qualify this with, we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. And as we shall see as we go along the route to sanctity, that it is in the misunderstanding of these terminologies that makes so many shy away from such terms as spiritual and saint. It is also the reason that so many members shy away from the so-called spiritual side of the program, or have so much unnecessary difficulties with the spiritual life. They have a completely distorted idea of what spiritual life and sanctity really mean. Perhaps it will be a good idea to restate here what we said in our very first Golden Book about spirituality and sanctity, and many of the reasons which are responsible for wrong conceptions of their true meaning. Many have difficulty with the spiritual side of the program because they have a distorted idea of what is meant by the term spiritual. To many, such a term conjures up in their minds innumerable prayers, a long face, isolation in human qualities of human associate, a retreating gait, somber groanings, and what have you. Nothing could be farther from the truth. A spiritual person is one who does what he has to do, when he has to do it, in the best way he can do it, and who expects and gets the guidance and strength and success from God through humble prayer and meditation. They realize that whether they pray or eat or work or play or sleep, they do it all for the honor and glory of God, and thus praise God in doing His will. Or, as one recent spiritual writer expresses this truth very succinctly, even if it bores you to death to pray, pray anyway because it pleases God. So let's try to answer two very relevant questions. 1. What is sanctity? 2. What does God want us to do? There have been literally thousands of books written on what is sanctity, many good, many bad, most confusing, indefinite, and regulatory ad infinitum. To answer the second question, there can be no doubt just what God expects of us. He tells us over and over again, be perfect. Therefore, there can be no doubt that also He does expect perfection in us, that He expects sanctity of everyone, for perfection is sanctity. But just what is precisely this perfection, this sanctity which He demands? And we know that He is obligated to lavish the means of attaining to it, since we are here in this world by His choice, not by our own. So, just as a parent who begets or adopts a child is responsible for that child, so Almighty God, who has adopted us all as His children, is responsible to us, to see to it that we have all the things we need to fulfill His command, be perfect. And here He also, in so commanding, expects sanctity in us all, His children. But specifically, just what is this sanctity, this perfection He expects, in fact, demands of all? Does it mean that God expects all of us to reach a stage wherein everything is virtue and nothing is sin? Does it mean that we are all expected to reach that state of perfection wherein there is only good and no evil? Does it mean that He demands that we all reach that state wherein our every act is perfect? Perhaps in eternity. But we are not in eternity. We are very earthbound as yet. So, just what does sanctity consist of here and now? We feel that a much simpler idea of sanctity than that which is contained in many spiritual books is a very necessary thing for most of us. We feel that putting sanctity in its true perspective will not only enable the average John Doe to understand it, but also that he will endeavor to attain it, not as something ethereal and out of this world with its halo shielding it from most of us, but something real and practical and attainable by everyone without exception. We will endeavor in our own stumbling way to do this. It will be a little bit different from the average explanation and approach to sanctity, to perfection, and to God. It will even be a bit unique, but an attempt will be made to keep it simple, and it will be, we sincerely hope, valid, orthodox, and perhaps bring many readers at least to the starting line leading to the spiritual life, to sanctity, and to God. Perhaps our explanation of sanctity may be somewhat like the incident which we experienced some years back. It was in a small Midwestern town, and we were attending a banquet of the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization. Seated next to me was the abbot of a nearby newly founded Trappist monastery, and usually abbots of Trappist monasteries did not go around attending banquets. We mentioned this fact to him. Yes, it is unusual, he said. In fact, as far as I know, it is probably the first time it has ever happened. And then he slyly added, and when Rome finds out about it, it may be the last time. So we will give you our idea of what sanctity means, and what God means when He says, be you perfect. It may be the first time ever expressed just in this way, but then it may also be the last time too, verbally or in writing. But it is merely our own opinion, as is everything in AA. And you know something? Even with the thousands of screwy opinions voiced about various things in AA, they work. They really do. We like to divide sanctity into three kinds or qualities. 1. Heroic sanctity, in which classification we find such stalwart men and women of history as St. Paul, the apostles, the martyrs, and the like, all of whom accomplished great deeds perfectly both in view of God and man. They were outstanding individuals chosen by God for outstanding public deeds. Theirs were very special vocations chosen specifically by God for a specific work in a heroic manner, and at the same time were public figures in history's annals. We may possibly, here or there, imitate some of their virtue in kind, but never in their heroic quality. No one is ever expected to do so, unless called explicitly by God as they were. We are never sure, of course, but we do not think He has rung your phone as yet. We admire them, we venerate them, we applaud them and the grace of God, which accomplished such great things through them, but we can never identify with them in kind. They practiced heroic sanctity. 2. Solemn sanctity. In this class, we find a long list of canonized saints. These were the men and women of history who performed eventually through the call and grace of God's heroic virtue, but did not accomplish outstanding tasks or deeds in public life. However, all the saints did whatever they had to, perfectly. St. Teresa of Lisieux, in her own autobiography, emphasized the fact that great deeds are not necessary to qualify for heroic virtue. Perfection in simple daily life also takes heroism, a special vocation. She simply did all the things each day in her ordinary life as a nun, perfectly. She was canonized. She proved that heroic virtue, worthy of solemn canonization, can be in very simple and ordinary deeds done perfectly, because it is God's will. Her sanctity and all the other canonized saints also were recipients of very special grace and vocation. These too we admire, we venerate, we applaud them and the grace of God which accompanied such perfection in them, albeit simple. But again, we cannot expect to identify with them without specific vocation. They practiced heroic virtue, and thereby were deemed worthy of solemn sanctity. Canonization. 3. Simple sanctity. Here we find, or should find, the rest of the vast human race. You and you and you and me. It is not a special vocation, it is a universal vocation to all mankind, to be saints, to be perfect. What does this really mean? It means, first and foremost, that we must accept ourselves as we are, today, good or bad, sinner or saint, ignorant or educated, screwball or alcoholic, or both, or rich or poor, Catholic, Protestant, Jew, agnostic, single, married, working or out of work, and on and on. Exactly whatever we are now. Then we do the best we can to fit in this place in life as we are, with what we have, not what some pious theorist tells us we ought to be or have. Let us never forget that one thing sanctity is not. It is never objective. This is precisely the error made by many spiritual writers. To be a saint, they tell us, we must do this and that, and follow this rule and that, and obey this law and that, perfectly. Far be it for us to discredit the value of rules and regulations and laws as in the extreme views of those who criticize authoritarianism. But all rules and regulations and laws, human or divine, are to be obeyed in so far as one is capable of so doing, and according to God's providence. The old Romans used to say, omnis leges secundum capacitatem. All laws are to be obeyed according to the capability of the individual. Again, this is not objective, but subjective. They say, facientem quod est in se, Deus non denegat gratiam. This means, whoever does what in him lies, God will not deny the grace. To will, not necessarily to accomplish. Therefore, the perfection which God expects is in the willing, not in the fulfillment. And we may be surprised on Judgment Day to find many whom we looked upon as big sinners in this old world as saints in eternity. Peace on earth to men of good will. Perhaps we will better understand this whole idea of sanctity by using the term sanctio, sanction, rather than sanctus, holy, saintly. Sanctus is used referring to God. He is holy, all holy. But anyone who has the approval, the sanction of God today is a saint, and either has or is on the road to sanctity. A man approved by God, not men, nor you, nor me. Therefore, in order to start on this road, one must be a good sinner. This means that one must admit that he is a sinner. We must admit and accept ourselves as we are, and then be ready to fit in. God will do the rest in His time and His way. This is the basis for the first and most necessary of the virtues, humility. It is the first step of AA. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives were unmanageable. It is emphasized in each of the subsequent steps of the program, as we shall later on see. For instance, the inventory, steps 4, 5, and 6, and the chapter in the AA book on how it works and into action. For after all, this whole idea of adjustment to life, to God's will, to His approval, His sanction, to sanctity, is nothing more nor less than a mixture of three basic ingredients: weakness plus willingness plus grace. The first and the latter are always there. We go in the middle. So don't stumble over number one. The weak ones of this world God has chosen to confound the strong, lest we be like the little boy who went to confession and said, "Bless me, God, I forgot my sins." So it is that the AA book says we are not saints. We are willing to grow along spiritual lines. This does not deny that sanctity is the final aim. Right now, we are seeking God's approval, His sanction, whatever we are. He will make the saint in His own time and in His own way, here or hereafter. Again, back to step number one, we have become honest. We are big sinners, but having humbly admitted it, we have God's approval, His sanction. And behold the paradox of paradoxes, the sinner saint. We have just joined the Sinners Club. No officers, no meetings, no dues, just a daily prayer. O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. We have taken the first step in obtaining the sanction of God. We begin to be saints. We begin to fit in life and providence, just as we are, with no excuses, like the little girl used when she told her mother that her brother broke her doll. "How did he do it, honey?" queried the mother. "I hit him over the head with it," whimpered the little girl. Speaking of fitting in just as we are, we must realize that, although all are born free and equal, this refers to rights, legal and eternal, but it does not mean that we are all psychologically or physically or mentally equal. We are all a little different, and this must be understood clearly if we wish to understand the providence of God and the question of being perfect and of sanctity. We hope this will vividly demonstrate why it is that we say that perfection, sanctity, is never objective. It is not a matter of perfect objective adherence to the laws of God and of spiritual life, but it is in the willingness to aim and try to adjust to God's will for us, beginning with that particular type personality and character with which He has endowed us. This alone will explain the mystery of "Be you perfect," which is telling us, be what I have willed you to be. Fit in my providence with that which I gave you, whatever the personality may be. And here we find many types, and if we pictorialize it a bit, it will show this seeming inequality in the ease with which some seem to adjust, while others find such difficulty. But if we remember willingness is perfection, there will be no real inequality. It will also give every alcoholic and many, many others in life a bit more hope, and perhaps faith and confidence, every joy. As long as we bear in mind sanctity, perfection, is having the sanction of God, not perfection of actions. On the following pages, we have a series of 8 figures, each one expressing a type of person. There are, of course, many, many shades more, but these will suffice to emphasize the fact that sanctity is sanction, not of men, nor of you, nor of me, but only of God, today. The round individual. He is very normal, and since he will have little difficulty fitting in. The place for him in life is the most frequently found, a round peg in a round hole. Here we have the square one. He will find it a lot more difficult to find the square hole, and he will not fit in a round one. He must find the square one, or at least be willing. The angular personality. Still more unique than the first 2 ones, and also it will be more difficult for him to find his fit. He may even fail because of this, but what did we say? Not perfection of action, but of willingness. Behold the egghead. And just what do we mean by egghead? Your interpretation is as good as any. Getting more common, but we wonder whether the holes of that shape are growing apace. In any case, it will still be more difficult for him, and once again we repeat and repeat and repeat. It is willingness. The alcoholic. He is in for a very rough time. A lot of cutting off rough edges is necessary to find us fit. But what was it? willingness, willingness, willingness. And some 300,000 have rubbed off a lot of edges, or at least are willing. The alcoholic neurotic, still more rough edges, still more difficulties in cutting, but still whole, still rational. And once again we call out to all, it's willingness, willingness, willingness. The psychoneurotic. There will be a lot of broken and bruised parts along the way of life, but there is a fit in the will and providence of God. And if it fits there, and if there is union of wills, the human and the divine, there is sanction. Here we see the psychopathic personality. There is already a break of reason. There is no freedom of human will, but there is freedom of divine will. And between you and me, we are going to look for them in the upper tier, up there in eternity. The preceding figures were used to demonstrate more realistically what we mean when we say that sanctity is subjective, which is again the willingness to adjust to life and God's will for us. His will already has been adjusted to us from all eternity, so whatever figure may point to us, we must fit in whether we like it or not. And we feel most of our readers, being alcoholics, will find themselves either in figure 5 or 6, or who knows, maybe a number 1 will be reading this. We still must all fit in as we are to what God has willed for us, willingly or unwillingly. It is true we have a free will, but in certain applications in the life of an individual personality, there is only one way, or else. What do we read in the big AA book? We all reached the point where there were only 3 choices left: sobriety, insanity, or death. So these marks are indelible. How do we adjust? How do any of the above achieve sanctity? Simply seek the will of God for us, as we are today. Everyone in life is obligated to find his or her own adjustment. In AA, we work the program, the 12 steps, and one by one they lead up. They lead us up to God's will, as we read in step 11, seeking only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry it out. This is exactly repressive of what we have been describing about sanctity being subjective, and we shall see when we come to that step that is sanctity, for we have achieved God's approval, His sanction for us. It is the story of every soul. Sometime, somewhere, they all reach the moment of truth. It matters not what type they are, not only the alcoholic, but the heroic saints. All of them have had their moment of truth. And the heroic saints, seeking the approval and sanction of God, asked and then carried out the answer of, Lord, what will you have me do? Seeking knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry it out. Paul asked it, Mary Magdalene asked it, Peter asked it, but these great men and women asked it once and for all. We alcoholics are the kind who must seek it one day at a time, seeking knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry it out today. We are seeking God's approval, His sanction today. Sanctity has nothing to do with religion per se. It has only to do with the will of God for us, with God's approval, God's sanction of us today. This idea can and should be carried into every area of our living. Let's take a look-see. 1. In our homes, family. Whether we are father or the mother, whether we have a wife or no wife, a husband or no husband, children or no children, fine house or just a shack, or an apartment, or even a tent, the real question is, does God approve, sanction us today? Not does anyone else approve, but does God approve? If He does, we find sanctity in the home. How can we know whether God approves? All we have to do is ask our conscience honestly. 2. Our job. Whether we have a good or poor job, or no job, an easy or a difficult job, or own your own business. Does God approve? Have we His sanction? Sanctity is sanction. 3. In our social life. We may have many friends or few friends, close friends or transient friends, or even no friends, or even enemies. Christ did. Does God approve our attitudes and behaviors towards them all, friends or enemies? Do we have His sanction? Well, Sanctity is sanction. 4. Our thought life. Whether we have good thoughts or bad thoughts, or indifferent thoughts, or no thoughts. It is said that some people sit all day and think, while others just sit. The kind of thoughts which pass through our minds and imaginations mean nothing. The big question is, does God approve our attitudes towards them? Do the thoughts have His sanction, or does our will's reaction to the thoughts have His sanction? The kind of thoughts mean nothing. Our attitude toward them and what we do about them means everything. Has this His approval, His sanction? Sanction is sanctity. 5. In our financial affairs. We may have a little money, or we may have a lot of money. We may get a big salary or a small salary or income, or we may even have no money. Does God approve my attitude toward the handling of it today? Approval is sanction, and sanction is, what was that word? Sanctity. 6. Our moral lives. We may have committed lots of sins or few sins. No one has committed no sins. Lots of big sins or a few big sins. Lots of little sins or a few little sins. Maybe no big sins. In AA? Let us remember again, sanctity, simple sanctity, does not exclude sins, not even big ones. The big question is, what is our sincere will towards sin? Many theologians, in fact, hold that there is such a thing as a cross of sin. There are the ones who try and try and try and try and fail again and again and again. They may be carrying a cross of sin, which is the nearest one to the one Christ carried. We our own sins, He the world's sins. So when we see the slipper, the seeming big sinner, the recidivist, repeater, yes, even the public sinner, let us never, never judge. For what is it that AA teaches us? There but for the grace of God go I. And who knows, who really knows just whom has God's approval, permissive providence? Not men, nor you, nor me, but only God. Does He approve? Has He sanctioned this whole affair? Well, let's be honest. He did approve by permitting just lots of big sins in the life of Mary Magdalene, and Paul, who hated the Christians as Saul, and Peter, who denied Him, and on and on and on, up to that guy or gal we point our finger at and whisper, unclean. Let us not deceive ourselves. Sanctity is sanction. And that guy or gal may be, just may be on the way to becoming another Mary Magdalene, or Paul, or Peter, lugging the cross of sin now, but willingly. Sanction is sanctity. Not sanction of sin, but sanction of the sinner who is willing. After all, the Holy Spirit breathes where He will, and when He wills, in the total providence of God, setting up of in detail the foundation in humanity for eternity, God's own masterpiece. The saints in eternity with all the darks and lights, the highlights and the shadows, the smooth, the brilliant, and the deep dark canvas on which He, the divine artist, paints and paints and paints you and you and you and me. 7. Now the spiritual life. Do we say lots of prayers or a few prayers or no prayers? Do we make many sacrifices or only a few sacrifices or no sacrifices today? It does not matter now, for if it be part of God's overall plan, if it be His will, eventually we will be very prayerful. The question again is, does God approve today's spiritual life? Does our spiritual life have His sanction, His approval, sanctity today? 8. Then there are our emotions. Everyone has emotions, nerves. Some have strong ones, others have weak ones. It makes no difference. We may get angry or we may not get angry very often. We may be very placid, elated, agitated, irritated, fearful, courageous, crying, jittery, or what have you. All these may be true emotions, or they may just all be feelings. It all makes no difference. Does God approve? We can never judge one another, particularly in the world of emotions or feelings, but God can and does. Again, does he approve? Does he perhaps sanctify these things? His sanction is sanctity. 9. In our AA life, do we have lots of slips, a few slips, no slips? Do we make many 12-step calls, a few such calls, or perhaps no such calls? Do we go to many meetings, a few meetings, no meetings? It all matters little. What matters very much, though, is does God approve our AA for us? For God's sanction is everything, is sanctity. It is his approval which counts, not our own nor others. However, God does use a guide, an advisor, a sponsor very often to express his approval through them. This will avoid misjudging our own prowess, our own ability, our own progress and capabilities. These are usually irrelevant to sanctity, and as sanctity are always subjective. Or as the dad told his boy who was bragging about winning the 100-yard, then the mile race, "That surely is fine, lad, but never forget, if it was against a jackass, you would have lost every time." So in AA and in all spiritual life, we seek advice, not agreement. Many people go to person after person after person for advice until they find someone to agree with them. God's approval? We don't think so, senor. Do you? One big danger in the spiritual life and seeking sanctity, we want too much, too quick. Why is this dangerous? Because if we reached objective sanctity too suddenly, there would be no place to go but down. That is why we must seek advice and not concentrate on trying to be objective saints, but only the approval of our lives today. Whatever there may be or have been today, by God, not men nor us, only the sanction of God, that is sanctity. However, we can concentrate on being good, objective sinners every day, for there is no place to go but up the 12 steps. So let's take them, one at a time, along the road to sanctity to reach happy sobriety, with God's approval, with his sanction, with his sanctity. The 12 steps to sanctity. 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives were unmanageable. Our very first statement in the 12 steps, we note, is an admission of our own powerlessness, that our very lives have become unmanageable. Being an alcoholic and powerless over alcohol, so that our lives are bottoms up, does not in itself indicate a sinner or sin. Let us never forget that alcoholism is a disease. An alcoholic, one who is powerless over alcohol, whose life is unmanageable, is a very sick person. We should never for a moment forget this. If a new guy or gal does, he may fail the program. However, the odds are very high that he is also quite a sinner, something which may or may not be mixed up with his alcoholism. So we are powerless, and we really mean it. We are unmanageable in our lives, and we really mean it. If this is true, then God approves, sanctions it, for being God, he cannot very well deny truth. Now comes the paradox again, the sinner saint. We, in this first step, are powerless, our lives are unmanageable, and without a doubt we are also sinners, and probably big ones. But in making this admission today, we have the approval of God, we have his sanction, and sanctity is sanction. Read on. We hear objections. How can such a person ever make himself worthy of God? Who's kidding whom? Whoever made themselves worthy of God? Always and everywhere and with everyone, the very first step to God is to admit our unworthiness. What use has God for a worthy person? They do not need him. But the alcoholic, the powerless one, the unmanageable one, the unworthy one, not only needs God, but needs him absolutely. This is why, since the beginning, without exception, the powerless ones, the weak ones, the unmanageable ones, the sinners, the failures, the sick and the blind and the lame and the alcoholics, All, 2, came to believe that a power greater than themselves could restore them to sanity. And may we interpolate a bit, also to sanctity, with his approval, with his sanction. Why the term power greater than ourselves? Many are confused by this and ask, why not use the term God? Well, the reason is quite simple. Many who come into AA have no idea of God. Alcohol is no respecter of persons, and the program of AA is open to all. Christians, Jews, agnostics, atheists, even to Mao Tsung should he be an alcoholic. They need help and must accept a power greater than themselves, the idea of a power, any subjective idea that they have honestly. To ask and demand they accept the orthodox idea of God at this juncture would be foolhardy. Even in step 2, as throughout the program, the term God as we understood him is used. Why? Because again, each one can only accept God as he honestly, in his conscience, understands him. It is all he has. It is God. And you know something? God approves and gives his sanction because it was he who first gave each one the belief he has. Faith is a gift, and given or withheld from each. He gives both the quantity and quality. It is true that reason leads to faith, to God. But it is God who guides that reason which has found him, in just so far as he wills. This he approves, this he sanctions, and regardless of the quality, the amount, or depth of the faith, or of the subjective idea the individual has honestly of a power greater than himself, if he came to believe he has God's sanction today. Sanctity in an agnostic? Could be. You know, there are Christians and Jews and believers of all sorts who are still very, very big sinners. Faith cannot be bought. Faith cannot be forced. Faith cannot be the measuring rod. It is a gift in quantity, in quality, and in depth. So whatever be the quantity, or the quality, or the depth, or the lack of faith we may have today, let's be one who has 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. We turn them over just as they are, today. It may very well be possible that our will is not very willing today. We may be very hesitant, or rebellious, or resentful, or full of self-pity. But let's turn it over to him so he will be able to remove the hesitancy, the resentment, the rebellion, the self-pity, or what have you. This, by the very fact of turning our will over to him, will obtain his approval, his sanction. It is the only will we have. Today. Give it to him as it is. Therefore, then, as we learned in the first and second step, he will not only restore us to sanity, give us power, manage our lives, but also will clean up our will so that we can become willing, completely willing. And with that comes complete approval, sanction. And what have we been saying over and over again? Sanctity is sanction. We aim our will at God as is. He strengthens and remakes it. They join to each other, the human and the divine. That is perfection. That is sanction. That is approval. That is sanctity. The union of wills, not the perfection of action. The union of wills, a phrase we will use again and again, because to repeat right now, the union of wills, the human and the divine, is perfection, the only true perfection, the only true sanctity. For what does it profit a man if he perfect every action of life according to the law, if he does not have the approval of God, if his will and the divine will run contrary to one another? Well, what does it profit? So let's turn ours over to him today, no matter what condition it has fallen into. And throw in our lives, too. They may also be very messy, but again, it is the only life we have, just like our will. So let's not even right now take a look at the awful mess. Let's take a good look at God as we understand him, i.e. your honest conviction of God for you. He will, as we mentioned in the step above, restore us to sanity, and we shall have his approval, his sanction, today. Then he will help us with our step 4, and we will be convinced that He approves it. 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. We make this inventory, searching and fearless, with the knowledge now that He wants us to, and therefore, as we said, approves and sanctions it, regardless of its contents. This should take away all guilt. We are not guilty. God asks us to take an inventory for forgiving, totally, not for condemning. Hence, we have no guilt. We had responsibility, and we will have the responsibility of doing what we can beginning today, but no guilt, please. Sorrow, yes, but this is an act of the will, and God approves. But guilt? No. This is feelings, self-pity, regret, etc., and all the destructive attitudes towards ourselves. This God does not approve. Remember, again, it is willingness, 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 and guilt is never in the will. Guilt in its two meanings exists only in the emotions or in judgment. Let's have neither, lest we be our severest judge and blind us to God, His mercy, His love, His will and willingness to forgive. Then in step 5, we will, without regret or guilt or remorse, be one who, gladly, though perhaps with difficulty, sought out someone, and 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Our admission to God gains His approval and sanction. Our admission to ourselves, honestly, makes us willing, and our admission to another human being clarifies and permits this third party to join our will with God's, as to the past, the present, and the future aims. We learn much about God and His will for us in AA from this sponsor, or advisor, or friend. He has been through it all, including step 5, and our conviction is that God sees us there, together, one admitting, the other listening and advising. He approves with a very big, broad smile. Both have His sanction. Both have His approval. And perfection? What did He say about it through Paul? Charity is the bond of perfection. And in the 5th step, we have charity at work in reality and in truth. Approval, sanction, perfection. We mentioned that God smiles. Does God smile? Well, far be it for us to go into the theology of it. Your opinion is as good as mine. But we feel quite sure that He must have a sense of humor. For to have created all of us in this world with all of our eccentricities and differences and peculiarities, just as you and we have for His greater honor and glory, He had to have a sense of humor. And how can anyone with a sense of humor not smile at least once in a while? In fact, we believe that He smiles quite often at some of the things we in our small imaginations make such big issues out of. But that is only our opinion. But it might be a very good opinion to take along on your 5th step. The wrongs we admit, does God approve them? Not precisely. He did permit them, and He certainly approves your telling and admitting them to Him, yourself, and another human being with a smile. Then you will see that it was much easier for us, and that we were 6, entirely ready to have God remove all those defects of character. Ready and willing. And if we are ready and willing, then we can be sure that He also is ready and willing to do it. And that automatically His approval, His sanction. In case you should happen to wonder, we are watching a saint being assembled out of a mess of rubble. So read on. Let's for a moment go back to the 8 figures we saw in the beginning of this booklet. Remember the bumps, the irregular lines, the rough spots? Well, here we say to Him, "And now, dear God, you fit us in, for evidently we have not yet found our niche. Maybe we will find it in AA. In fact, I know we will, if we are willing, for we are no longer trying to fit in. From now on, we are ready and willing for you to do it in your way. Then we will know our niche, and you having fitted us to it, we will have your approval, your sanction, and your will. And all we will have to do from now on, one day at a time, will be as we shall have at least the good will to do in step 11, to be joined to your will." Sanction, approval, perfection. Never forget, we said we would mention it over and over and over again. Perfection is in the union of wills, not in the perfection of actions. And we will have, in the next step, 7, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. Since God does usually act in His time and in His way, He ordinarily does not act precipitously, right now. He lets us grow, as He permits all nature to grow. That is why the AA book says, we are willing to grow. Therefore, He does not remove our defects of character right now. He will erase them, gradually, like all erasing. So, since we shall have many of these defects left for a long time, maybe even until eternity, they will cause shortcomings. We must expect them. We must accept them. We must humbly ask Him to remove them in His time and in His way. But you know something, pal? If He permits them to remain in spite of our requests, prayers, and efforts, He does approve. We do have His sanction in spite of them. Remember Paul? The good that I will, I do not. The evil I detest and will not, that I do. What will release Him? He tells us, the grace of God. And you want to know when He will begin to remove them? On the day we reach that first word in step 7 in our lives, humbly asked Him. For humility is the one act, the one virtue, the one fact in human life which brings quick approval, quick sanction. Remember the stories in the Scriptures about the Pharisee and the publican? Both went up to the temple to pray, and the Pharisee stood way up front, and stood way up. Then he enumerated all of his virtues, how he gave to the poor, how he gave tithes to the temple, very humbly, and undoubtedly very loudly, although the Scriptures do not mention it, but we feel he was also looking out the backside of his eye on that critter in the rear. He then exclaimed for all to hear, "Thank God I am not like the rest of men, like that publican. He even smells bad." The Scriptures left those last 4 words out, too. Then the publican, poor, disheveled by his work, and with head bowed, not even daring to lift his eyes to heaven, softly but humbly, and with much reverential love of God, said, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Did he join the Sinners' Club? The Scripture then brings out the true relationship between God and man, and sin and virtue, and justification and sanctity. The publican returned to his house justified rather than the Pharisee. What was that? The publican had obtained God's approval, His sanction, not men's, nor his, nor yours, nor mine, but God's. Sanction is sanctity. He was absolutely honest. He was absolutely humble. He was justified, sanctified. He had become a man approved by God, not men, nor by Pharisee, nor anyone but God. And with that approval, in his humility was given birth to sanctity. Through the grace of God, in spite of the condemnation of men. How about you? With this picture in our memory, will it be easy to have 8? Made a list of all persons we had harmed, and became willing to make amends to them all. In this step we see at work the charity, which is the bond of perfection, and the willingness, which is the aim of perfection. When we, in the first and second steps, admitted the need for help and were willing to let a power greater than ourselves, God, as we understood Him, take over the restoring of us to sanity and sobriety, we learned also that our willingness had opened the door to sanctity. Being completely willing made our aim toward sanctity true. In step 8, we find many great defects from our past living, and we also know darn well that we, being virtually bankrupt in all areas of living, could not immediately make up the harm we had done to so many. But again, here, as we have pointed out in our recent pages, perfection, sanctity, is not made up from actions of perfection, but from willingness. So we are willing to make amends to them all, and in the next step we will see that all is still only our aim, our willingness, not necessarily our accomplishment. Probably most AAs will never be able to make amends to them all because charity, which is the bond of perfection, the seal of sanctity, will prevent us from making some of the amends lest in the doing we injure others. This is the charity which we are told binds perfection. So it is that in step 9 we made direct amends to people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Note what we just pointed out above. Made direct amends, except when to do so would injure them or others. We are obligated by the law of charity, by the love of our neighbor, to omit amends whenever making them would injure them or others. We do not take into consideration our own selves, but them or others. In these instances, we simply omit them and we ask God to make the amends for us. Many times this is very much more difficult than we think. The leaving of the amends to God demands on our part trust in Him and a deep humility in ourselves, since we will never be sure that they are made except by faith in Him and His love and His ability to do so. We find ourselves saying to ourselves and others, I wish I could make these particular amends. This is pride, whereas humility tells us we can't, God will. Once more, it is the willingness on our part to let Him do so with a deep faith and trust that He will. He, through His law of love, the law of charity to our fellow man, asks that we do it this way. And when we do it in this way, then He has approved, He has sanctioned what we have done. Reread this step. Note how good God is. Particularly note how simple He makes it for us. He does not say, you must make every little amend to everyone without exception or else. He only asks that we do so wherever possible, when it won't hurt others. Did we hear someone remark that God did not write these steps? Well, maybe He did not. But He did use those early members of AA who did write them as instruments to bring His message to us alcoholics. And never let us forget the one factor of life. God will use us if we let Him, but He does not need us. So now let's travel up the 3 steps and see how He will use us if we let Him, or if we are willing. He approves, but the big question is, will we approve? If we do, then we are willing, and we will certainly have His approval, His sanction. And in all the repetitive steps, the inventory in 10, and the prayer in 11, and the carrying the message in 12, we will be men approved each day, one day at a time. Approval of God, not men nor us. Sanction, sanctity. 10. Continue to take personal inventory, and when wrong, promptly admitted it. As we have stated in many previous talks and books, we feel, in our opinion, that the first 9 steps put the alcoholic on the program. Each one is taken completely once and for all, although we must never forget number 1. Many AAs remind themselves of it every day. However, steps 10, 11, and 12 are continuing steps, day in and day out, or week in or week out, or as often as our honest conscience dictates their repetition. We repeat the personal inventory, the prayers and meditation, and the 12-step activities as often as we honestly think we should. Number 10, which we are now considering, is a personal inventory. And inventory of what? How good we are? How often we have succeeded? Or how often we have failed? We rather think it should especially look for only one thing: how willing we are. After all, that is all God asks from us, for approval, for sanction. Let's look more closely. If we constantly search for our successes, does He oppose? Of what? His own work? He gave these to us. It was His work. And if we continually look for our failures, do we fill ourselves with remorse and self-blame? He did not do these wrongs, but He did permit them. Now, where do we come in? How does this inventory get His approval? We have His approval, His sanction, as long as we are willing, trying. Our will is all that is ours, and it is willingness alone that is sure of His sanction. And when wrong, promptly admitted it. As we said above, God does not approve sin or wrong, but He does approve our willingness in face of failure and wrongs and sin. So here in our admission, we again become willing. Again, we have His approval, His sanction, and sanction is sanctity. 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him.
praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry it out. Behold, the very essence of perfection, the knowledge of the will of God and the power to carry it out. Many churchmen criticized AA in years gone by, saying AA was unacceptable to Christians because it was a merely naturalistic program. There can be little doubt that such people never read the 12 steps, especially the one we are considering now, the 11th step. In fact, some years ago, a very outstanding clergyman made the statement to us, a Catholic should not partake in the AA program because it is purely a naturalistic one. It took some time to get an honest answer from him when I queried him on whether he had ever read the 12 steps. In staccato, he kept saying, yes, 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 as he thumbed through a sheath of papers on his desk. Finally, we, in a louder voice, stopped him, asking very emphatically, did you ever read the 12 steps or not? To this he very begrudgingly said, well, no, but I know what they are. It was here that we took out the big AA book and read the 11th step very clearly and slowly and remarked, how can anyone read this step and miss the finger of God in it? Naturalistic? If any member would ever achieve this step perfectly every day, their name would probably be Teresa Blisia. For all in all, perfection, even heroic sanctity, must be brought about by perfect union of wills, the human and the divine. And when that union is uninterrupted and constant, that is heroic sanctity. He agreed. However, in AA and in ordinary practice, this does not happen. We do not work the 11th step perfectly, nor uninterruptedly, nor permanently. We only grow along spiritual lines. But God knows the weakness of our nature, and our honest try and try again breeds willingness to eventually join those two wills together, and God approves. He sanctions our willingness, and that is sanctity, simple though it may be. The prayer and meditation in this step brings God more and more into our conscious living. The praying for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry it out enables us to know His will for us so that we may join our will with His, and in the joining, He will give also the power and the strength to carry it out. And God approves. He still sanctions, not the failure, but us. So you ain't a saint? Only if you do not honestly try, only if you are not willing. And should you be one of those who are not willing, all you have to do is repeat and repeat and repeat, God, make me willing, which He will. Otherwise, if we do not even try or ask for willingness, we will, in all probability, one of these days begin all over again on step 1. So, here in step 11, let us seek, let us ask, let us try, and we will be men approved. 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. First of all, in step 12, we have a spiritual awakening. We awaken and we begin to see all things in the light of God's will, not men's. The most important thing we begin to realize is the value of spiritual things, the effectiveness of God's help, and the necessity of our will submitting to Him, the joining of wills. We have finally realized once and for all that we are men approved, that we have God's approval, 1, to carry the message to alcoholics, and 2, that God's will for us is to practice these principles in all our affairs. May we quote from a little 2-page pamphlet distributed by many AA groups here and there. God in His wisdom has selected you and all AAs to be the purveyors of His goodness. In selecting them through whom to bring about this phenomenon, He went not to the mighty, the famous, or to the brilliant. He went to the sick, to cast-offs, to the unfortunate. He went right to the alcoholic, the so-called weakling of this world. Well might He have said to us, into your weak and feeble hands I have entrusted a power beyond estimate, which, when used for other alcoholics, directly returns to you in strengthening your own sobriety.
This was not given to some of the most learned of your fellow men, not to scientists, not to statesmen, not to wives or mothers, not even to your closest friends and loved ones has this gift been given. The ability of identifying with and of healing the sick alcoholic while at the same time increasing your own quality and length of sobriety. It must be used unselfishly, because it is the latter you are to use to ascend the rungs towards spiritual perfection and to the fulfillment of my will both for you and for them. Through AA, you will eventually join them all with mine, held together for all eternity by this bond of perfection in charity. You were selected because you were the outcasts, the weak ones of this world, and the long experience of alcoholism in yourself would make you keenly alert to the cries of distress that would come from the lonely, dying hearts of alcoholics everywhere. So keep ever in mind the admission you made when you entered the ranks of AA, namely, that you are powerless, then, now, and forever, and that it will always be dependent upon your willingness to turn your life and your will into my keeping. For it is in doing this you gain my approval, my sanction, and your sobriety. And what are the principles of AA for which we daily seek approval? They are many. They are all in these 12 steps. They are, as we just quoted above, the rungs of the ladder you are to use to ascend to and gradually grow towards spiritual perfection and the fulfillment of my will. Approval, sanction, sanctity. Let's at least begin. The entire working of AA, wherein the power of God, as we understand him, not only reclaims but rehabilitates and perfects, is beautifully expressed in the poem The Old Violin. 'Twas battered, scarred, and the auctioneer thought it was scarcely worth the while to waste his time on the old violin, but held it up with a smile. "What am I biddin', good people?" he cried. "Who'll start the bidding for me? $1, now two, only two, $2, and who'll make it three? $3 once, $3 twice, going for three, but no, from the room far back a gray-haired man came forward and picked up the bow. Then, wiping the dust from the old violin and tightening up the strings, he played a melody pure and sweet as the angel sings. The music ceased, and the auctioneer, with a voice that was quiet and low, said, 'What am I bid for the old violin?' And he held it up with the bow. $1,000, and who'll make it two? 2,000, and who'll make it three? 3,000 once, 3,000 twice, and going and gone," said he. "We don't quite understand. What changed its worth?" Swift came the reply. "The touch of the Master's hand, and many a man with a life out of tune and battered and torn with sin is auctioned cheap to the thoughtless crowd, much like the old violin. A mess of pottage, a glass of wine, a game, and he travels on. He's going once and going twice. He's going and almost gone. But then the Master comes, and the foolish crowd never can quite understand the worth of a soul and the change that is wrought by the touch of the Master's hand." Throughout history, no one was more indicted, more scorned, and called more hopeless by the passing crowd than the alcoholic. Doctors, lawyers, judges, clergymen, and all agreed again and again that the alcoholic was the one hopeless case. But then came AA, and 300,000 hopeless cases have been restored to sobriety and society by the touch of the Master's hand, God, as we understood him. In the preceding pages of this little booklet, we have seen how these alcoholics can and have ascended 12 steps, joined to the will of God, and instead of cast-offs, become men approved, sanctioned not by men, nor by you, nor by us, but by God. But before we proceed any further along, let's stop a moment and go back in history of the not too distant past, when a fellow by the name of John F. Kennedy was sworn in as President of the United States. It is not our intention to be in any way politically entangled, but in his inaugural address he made a statement which has remained very firmly in our memory. He related the various proposals for his administration and then added, "These things will not be accomplished in an hour, or a day, or in weeks or months, perhaps not even in years. But let's at least begin." So may we now repeat all of the foregoing in our booklet, and repeat these words again. We may not achieve all these things we spoke of, including sanctity, in an hour, nor a day, or a week, or a month, maybe not for years, in fact, maybe not fully until death, or even into eternity, but at least let's begin. We may be able to dry up in an hour, or a day, or days, but total sobriety, total sanctity, comes to us as everything else in life by growth. As the AA book says, we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. And we will be doing just that for not only days or months or years, but for a lifetime. So let's at least begin. The brilliant principle which AA incites on to the new and old members over and over again is easy does it. You didn't get drunk overnight, and you won't reach full sobriety overnight. In fact, it will take maybe months or years, but let's at least begin. Also in AA, the spiritual life, we are willing to grow, not for an hour, nor a day, nor months, nor even years, but until death, but one step, one day at a time. Easy does it. Let us not be fooled by the AA book statement into taking only half of it. We are not saints, period. Me a saint? Never. Let's read it all. We are not saints, but we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. And so, just as a seed of corn will eventually become a stalk of corn if it grows, so will everyone, even the biggest sinner, someday become a saint if he is willing to grow along spiritual lines. The AA philosophy tells us that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines, and by this fact tells us that the ultimate for all AAs is sanctity. And, as we have read all throughout this booklet, it is very simple, but a one day at a time process, and always and everywhere, in all things good, bad, and indifferent, it is solely dependent upon and achieved by the obtaining of the approval of God for us, as we understand His will in our honest conscience. Is this difficult? Hardly, but it may be lengthy, and it may not be achieved as a matter of habit in an hour, or a day, or a week, or even a lifetime. But to all in AA who make an honest effort to grow, it will be achieved, at least in eternity forever, men approved, saints. So, let's at least begin. All in AA may very readily and efficiently carry this all into many phases of living. One, in our homes, the family. Those problems which seem to pile up so high in families, entailing mother, father, and children, we may not solve them in an hour, or a day, or a month, or for years, but let's at least begin. And speaking of problems, we believe it would be a good idea to reprint here a statement from our Golden Book of Excuses, which will very dramatically emphasize, we hope, the tremendous importance of the phrase we are meditating upon, not only in the pursuit of sanctity, but in all problems. On the plains of desolation there bleaches the bones of countless millions who at the very dawn of victory sat down to wait, and waiting, died. So let's at least begin. 2. In our social activities, in and out of AA. Charity is the bond of perfection, but let us not forget that true charity is also a willingness to love our neighbor, good, bad, or indifferent, drunk or sober, sinner or saint, of whom you say there ain't. Liking is emotional, loving is willing. In fact, if we take the greatest of all the commandments, we will find that we must love our neighbor as ourselves. And love, real love, true love, is in the will. To men of good will, or, as our good Protestant friends might also say, good will to men. never forget sin, virtue, love, and sanctity are always in the will. So we meet lots and lots of alcoholics in AA. Let's have goodwill to all. Then God will approve. It may be days or weeks or years until we actually meet them all, but let's at least begin today by willing. Let's trade our sanction of them for God's sanction of us. 3. Giving sobriety to another. We many times will not be able to do so on the first call, in a day, nor a week, nor a month, maybe not for years, but let's at least begin. Then someday, in God's time and way, we will make it, and in the meantime, you will be staying sober. How many have slipped for years and years, but finally make it? Many after 5, 10, 15 years. Every attempt of ours, every try, every endeavor is known to God, and He approves your attempts to sober up others, giving proof in the sobriety given to you. And maybe He does, and maybe He doesn't explicitly approve of the other guy's or gal's repeated slipping, but He does permit them. He could, being God, stop them, but He doesn't. And as we have just mentioned above, eventually many of them He does give sobriety, and a very solid brand, along with His sanction. Approve their slipping? Maybe. Let us recall a cross of sin. Could be. So, let's at least begin. 4. The 12 steps. We hear much discussion in AA circles about these steps. How should they be taken? When they should be taken? How much in detail they should be taken? And especially how soon 12-step calls should be taken. Let's answer all very shortly. How should they be taken? By being willing to do so honestly in your own way. So let's at least begin. 1 to 12. Should they all be taken? In what order? Again, simply by being honestly willing to take them as you honestly think is best for you. So let's at least begin. How much in detail should each be taken? In being willing to do so in just that detail which you are honestly convinced is necessary for you. So let's get going. Let's at least begin. How soon should they all be taken? Just as soon as you are ready and willing. And may we admonish all, never force yourself to take a step against either your will or honest conviction. In reality, this is dishonest. God does not approve. But we should keep an open mind, so let's at least begin. How soon should a new member take 12-step calls? There is much disagreement among the groups as to the best answer for this one, but whenever they start, God will approve, and He will, in fact, go along on the call. So why not take Him along by prayer instead of figuring out what we are going to say? And our own personal opinion is that the new member should make a 12-step call. The sooner, the better. What has he to offer so soon? Well, he has a few days or weeks sobriety more than the one who called. In fact, sometimes we feel a long-time sober fellow or gal making a call might even scare the jittery, shaky prospect. 15 years? So let's at least begin. The sooner, the better. This will at least keep the new member sober. 12-step calls are the instrument of our sobriety. God is the source of all sobriety, of all sanctity. So let's at least begin. What was it that we quoted in the very beginning of our meditation on sanctity? Me, a saint? You know I ain't, and could never, never be. What's that you say? A man approved? Today? By God, not men, or even me, no matter what I am, or will ever, ever be? You mean that I... Again, let's read on, and this time really see one in the flesh who did receive approval and sanctity. It is a quotation from a recent letter received by us after the death of a priest member of Alcoholics Anonymous. For obvious reasons, we omit the name, place, and date. Its message also is quite obvious. We ourselves are truly grateful in playing a small part in Father X's sobriety. The letter was written to us by a lay member of AA. Dear Father, AA lost a wonderful member last week when Father X died. Death came rather quickly, although Father suffered greatly in the last 2 weeks. A high mass was sung yesterday for him at his funeral. The bishop gave one of the finest sermons I have ever heard. He started it with the Serenity Prayer and then spoke of Father's devotion to AA and how he had found the fullness of his vocation through AA. In closing, he expressed the wish that all bishops and priests could have witnessed Father's death. There were many priests and many non-Catholics present. I have attended a lot of funerals, but have never been so deeply affected. AA certainly lost a wonderful member, a wonderful man last week, and so did the priesthood. Father X, truly a man approved, by God, now a saint, in reality, in God's eternity. So let's you and me, and you, and you, and you, and all, at least begin today. The 12 steps. 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7. Humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. The Golden Book of Sanctity, another golden book by Father John Doe, Reverend Ralph Fow.